First of all, I'd like to introduce my wife and co-author, Marie Simovich, who's a professor at the University of San Diego, and with whom we co-taught a class on the natural history of the Anza Borrego Desert.
Hi, all of you. I'm just going to get out of the way for this evening and let Mike take over so we don't talk over each other and confuse all of you. But I'll see you later. Thank you.
So the book is titled The Natural History of the Anza Borrego Region. And the book is an overall review of the Anza Borrego, both through its history and also through its geography, geology, climate, and biology. And just to give you an idea of what's in the book, it's divided into two basic parts. One is the abiotic environment, which is basically what is a desert. Then we talk about climate, about geology, and about geography. And the second part is the biotic environment, which talks about, first of all, paleontology, or the history of life and organisms in the desert, and then talks about desert stresses and the adaptations of the plants and animals that live here. And then we also talk about human prehistory and how human beings moved into the desert and became part of that ecology. And people have very different visions of the desert. A lot of people think of the desert as this sort of severe, austere place where there's, of course, there's not much water, but there's also not much plant life, and also very few animals and human population. However, those of us that are a little bit more familiar with the desert know that it has very abundant life, though maybe not there all the time, and that there's a great diversity of life forms in the desert, and animals and plants that have adapted to these severe conditions. And the desert is a land of extremes. First of all, in temperature, we know that right now in the desert, it's well into the triple figures. And then at various times during the winter, it can be below freezing. And also in terms of the availability of water, deserts are deserts because they don't have much. But also when water does come to the desert, it can come in great abundance. A definition of a desert is an area where the evaporative power of the sun is greater than the amount of precipitation that falls on that same area throughout the year. And typically the soils of the desert tend to lack organic matter, and organic matter is kind of the stuff that sticks together soil particles. So that means that the soils in deserts tend to be loose, and also that there's high alkalinity and salinity in some areas, usually the lower lying areas where water drains. And water either is lacking most of the time, or when it does come, it comes in great abundance. And precipitation in the desert tends to be very patchy, both in space and time, meaning that it doesn't fall all the time, and also it doesn't fall everywhere. So we get, if you can see the picture on the right, you can see this is a desert thunderstorm during the summer, and a tremendous amount of water is falling in a very narrow, confined place. That may lead to flooding and flash flooding. And also the temperatures vary daily and seasonally. That during the day, we get a lot of insolation, but because there's a lack of atmospheric moisture, we don't have many clouds. So at nighttime, most of that heat radiates back up into the sky, and not much of it is retained. So we have a lot of variation between daytime and nighttime temperatures. And of course, during the course of the year, again, we'll have times when the temperatures can be as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and then times when it actually snows in the desert during the winter. And also, we tend to see convergent evolution in deserts that are in different parts of the world, that the plants and animals that have evolved in desert conditions oftentimes are very similar, even though they may not be directly genetically related. And as an example, for those of you that have been in the Southwest and see organ pipe cactuses, there are no cactuses in the old world. It is a new world family. However, some plants within the euphorb family have radiated into niches that are occupied by cactus in the New World. And so if you go to a place like Tanzania, you can see the candelabra tree, which is pretty much a dead ringer for the organ pipe cactus, even though they're in different families. And the foxes that live in deserts in 3 different continents, the fennec fox in Africa, the Corsic fox in Mongolia, and the kit fox in North America, all look very similar, though they belong to different clades within the fox genus. And also jerboas and kangaroo rats have very similar adaptations, even though they're not directly related. And the desert sidewinder in the American Southwest has a similar set of adaptations as the Saharan horned viper does in Africa. They both move by sidewinding, and they both have flaps that cover their eyes to protect them from sand. And we talk about, first of all, climate on the global scale to understand why different areas are deserts. And then also on the local scale to look at phenomena like rain shadows that are directly contributing to Anza Borrego being a desert. And we also actually discuss clouds quite a bit. And on the left, you can see that sort of stack of clouds. Those are lenticular clouds, which are clouds, a type of cloud that we see frequently in the desert. And they're caused by moving masses of air that encounter a topographic feature like a mountain range, and they're deflected upward. As they go upward, of course, the temperature decreases. And when the air temperature reaches the dew point, the water that's in it will condense and form a cloud. And so in the picture on the left, what you see is air is rising and it's reached its dew point and it produces one cloud. And now, of course, because a lot of the precipitation or a lot of the water has gone out of it, it has a lower dew point. And as it goes up, it reaches that lower temperature, makes another cloud, and so forth. And so you can get a stack of lenticular clouds, one on top of the other. On the right-hand side, we have the thunderstorm that's dropping sort of a cumulonimbus cloud that's dropping significant rainfall on the desert. We also talk about atmospheric and oceanic circulation and now how those contribute to the formation of the desert. And then we also talk about orogeny, which is mountain building, because this is one of the most powerful forces that have shaped the topography of California and also have created the conditions where deserts are formed because of rain shadow effects. We talk about subduction of marine plates, and then also the expanding crust or regional tension that also has formed mountains and valleys. And another aspect of mountain building is an overthrust fault. And there's an area in the southern part of Anza Borrego in the Coyote Mountains where you can see a good example of an overthrust fault. And that's where one tectonic plate is being pushed up and over another one. And when that happens, older sediments, which are on the bottom of the overthrusting fault, can go above younger sediments. And that's usually the reverse of what we see in geology, where we usually see newer deposits on top of older deposits. So this is called a nonconformity. And let me see. Anyway, right behind the little box here on the right, let's see if I can move it. Anyway, it's an example of a nonconformity, and it's one that's in a lot of geological textbooks that you can see in the southern part of Anza Borrego. And then we talk about the formation of the Southern California mountains, which the roots of them were formed by large plutons or molten magma that formed deposits about 60 to 100 million years ago. And then also because we have the San Andreas Fault, we have a spreading zone that is about where the Salton Sea is now, where the San Andreas Fault passes through. And because of that new material that's being created there, it creates crustal tension, meaning that the rest of the crust is being pushed away from that fault. And that is related to some of the topography that we see in Southern California. Now, let me just hold on a second. Okay. Another thing that we talk about in the book is the formation of the Imperial Sea. And many millions of years ago, as the San Andreas Fault was forming, the area that runs along the fault running along the west coast of southern North America and South America, it turned into a spreading zone, and that created the trough that is now the present Gulf of California. Well, at one time, about 6.5 million years ago, that trough reached all the way up to about better than 100 miles north of what is now presently the California-Mexican border. And that area was called the Imperial Sea, or what we call now the Imperial Sea. And some of the evidence that is left behind is if you've been in Anza Borrego and gone through Split Mountain, Fish Creek, and go to the south side, south of Split Mountain, most of the deposits that you see are marine deposits left by that period of inundation of the Imperial Sea. And if you look kind of off to the east, you can see these formations that are called elephant knees. And what elephant knees are, they're deposits of marine sediments. And in those deposits, you have areas that are more resistant to erosion. And those areas were caused by the formation of oyster shell reefs when that area was maybe 30 feet deep or so. And that led to conditions where oyster shell reefs and oyster shells and other mollusks formed reefs. And over time, as sediments were laid on top of them, they became compressed and formed a material that's called coquina, which is compressed shells. And on the right, that's a picture of it. And you can actually see these blocks of coquina in loop wash down to the south of Split Mountain. And also other evidence of the Imperial Seas are these sand dollar on your left and a scallop on your right that are found in deposits in the Fish Creek and Shell Reef area in Akatia Wells. Lake Cahuilla. As the Colorado River formed, and if you think about the Colorado River, think of those big areas like the Grand Canyon and Bryce Canyon, these big holes in the ground that were formed by the erosion of the Colorado River, and all that stuff had to go somewhere. And that stuff came down the Colorado River and came into the Salton Trough, which is that area that was formed by the San Andreas Fault. And over time, it formed a large delta. And the delta sort of blocked off the north end of the Gulf of California and then impounded water behind it to the north. And that formed a lake, which formed probably originally about 2.5 million years ago. But then over time, as the course of the Colorado River shifted, the lake would be filled and then empty and filled and then empty. And probably the latest time was during the 17th century. So basically, we just missed the last incarnation of Lake Cahuilla, but we believe that it existed there at least 4 times since the end of the Pleistocene, since the end of the ice ages. And if you go to Anza Borrego, and the hills that you see there in the background are the east end of the Santa Rosa Mountains. And you can see a very clear line of wave-cut terraces that go along the base of the Santa Rosa Mountains. And that's the high water mark of ancient Lake Cahuilla. And also we see the paleontology of Anza Borrego is very rich. We see both fossils of plants and animals of things that no longer exist there. For instance, this is petrified wood on the left of species that no longer exist in this area. And then on the right, this is an overhang in Split Mountain in the Fish Creek Mountains. And what you see there are the positive imprints of footprints that animals left there about 2.5 million years ago. And on the left is a gomphothere, the footprints of a gomphothere, which is an animal that's ancestral to mammoths and modern elephants. And 2.5 million years ago, a gomphothere stepped in a mud puddle and pulled his foot out. And when he did, he left this imprint. That same day, a dog probably about the size of a small wolf here to the right of the gomphothere. And then on the far right, also the print of a cat about the size of a bobcat were left behind. And over time, those feet print were filled by sediments that were more resistant than the mud that the footprint had been left in, so that as erosion took place, those feet print became positive molds that we can actually see now. Okay. And also, there's been, animals move around. They're very mobile. And one of the things that happened in the New World was what we call the Great American Biotic Interchange, where animals that had evolved in North America and animals that evolved in South America actually migrated back and forth over the Isthmus of Panama once it formed. And there isn't a good agreement on when that formed, probably sometime between 3 and 9 million years ago. But animals like placental carnivores like cats, saber-toothed cats, and dogs migrated south into South America. And then other animals like the terror birds, which were giant flightless birds that were high-end predators, migrated into North America, and also ground sloths, and then armadillos and possums. So there was an exchange in animals between North and South America. And then also some other animals that evolved here, such as horses and llamas, that evolved in North America, the llamas migrated to South America and are ancestral to alpacas and other animals. And the horses migrated to Asia and Africa and are the ancestors of our modern horses and also zebras and asses. Some of the other fossils that are found here on the left, there is a giant tortoise shell, and that's over a meter in length. It's over 3 feet in length. And on the right, those are dermal ossicles, or pellets of bone that formed in the skin of giant ground sloths. And these were probably a protection against predators. They basically covered the nape of the neck and the shoulders, and served as a type of armor to protect the animal. And the animals that it was being protected from are like the fellow on the left, which is a saber-toothed cat, and this skull is actually from La Brea. And then on the right is the jaw of a imperial mammoth found here in Anza Borrego. And when you think about it, probably the most prominent animals in the landscape of Anza Borrego at the end of the last ice age were elephants and gomphotheres, if you can imagine that. And a gomphothere, that's one on the left, and this is a species that had 2 sets of tusks in both the upper and lower jaws, and then the right is an imperial mammoth. And these are, I just wanted to say, these pictures are the drawings by pen and ink drawings done by Anne Kowalski, and I think they're very remarkable and accurate. And then horses and llamas, of course, they both evolved in the Western United States, and as I mentioned before, horses went across the Bering Strait and into Asia and Africa, and llamas went south into South America, and then went extinct in North America. And there are also carnivores here. On the left is a giant short-faced bear, which was the largest mammalian predator to ever walk North America, and it stood between 3 and 4 meters high on its back legs. And on the right is a saber-toothed cat, or a smilodon. Well, what happened to all these big animals that were here about 8,000 to 12,000 years ago? Well, most of them went extinct about that time. And this coincides with 3 different influences. One is climate change, is that the Pleistocene had come to an end and the climate in North America was becoming warmer and drier. So the habitats that were favored by these large mammals were getting smaller and moving north. And then also there was the entry of invasive competitors, primarily the bison, which came in very large numbers and was a fierce competitor for grazing land. And then also was the entry of humans into the Americas and the development of Clovis culture. And as human beings entered North America, they developed a culture that we call Clovis culture that is typified by large projectile points. And when we say large, we mean pretty large. And in many archaeological finds, these large projectile points are associated with the remains of large mammals that are being killed. So probably the combination of these 3 things, climate change, invasive competitors, and the overhunting by humans, contributed to the extinction of these large mammals. We also talk about how plants and animals survive in the desert. And for instance, this is a little diagram, an infographic of how animals absorb and also get rid of heat. We also talk about water gain and loss in plants. And then we talk a bit about how animals are adapted to the desert environment. And desert animals tend to have long, slender bodies and long, slender appendages. Okay. Also, closely related animals that live in the desert, as opposed to those that live in other places, tend to have less mass in their bodies. The picture on the left is a zebra tail lizard with a long, thin body and tail. And on the right, you have a picture of, on the left is a desert black-tailed jackrabbit, and on the right is an Arctic hare. They're both in the same genus, but note that the even though they're about the same length, that the Arctic hare's body is about twice the mass of the desert black-tailed jackrabbit. And also notice that the jackrabbit's ears are much longer than the Arctic hare's. These are both adaptations that enable the animal to dump off excess heat. Also, locomotion. Again, because there's not much organic matter in desert soil, it tends to be loose. And so animals that have to get around in the desert do so in ways that are adapted to that type of substrate. And one is by hopping. And when an animal hops, it's putting most of its force downward rather than back. And so if you're pushing backwards in loose material, most of your energy is displacing that material as opposed to moving your body. So hopping is an adaptation to loose substrates. Another one is sidewinding. And if you think about sidewinders and think basically of their body making an S shape. And when a sidewinder moves, its back loop is anchored and it pushes the front loop forward. Then that loop anchors and then it pulls the back loop up. And it does that, but it does it in quick succession so that it appears to be a constant motion, and it is. And not only does the sidewinder do this, but the Saharan horned viper does it as well in the Saharan desert. And then there's a structure in some mammals called a carotid reed. And what it is, it's a sinus in the skull. And in that sinus, arterial blood that is flowing to the brain crosses through venous blood that's coming back from the nose. And so that venous blood has been cooled, and as the blood vessels pass each other inside the reed, it cools off the arterial blood that's going to the brain. So animals that have a carotid reed are able to maintain a brain temperature several degrees cooler than their body temperature. It allows them to survive in what would otherwise be very trying conditions. So then we talk about desert animals and the suites of adaptations that they have to survive here. And like the kangaroo rat is probably the desert survival specialist. It's nocturnal, so it only comes out at night. It lives in burrows under the ground where it's cool. It stuffs its burrows with food that it eats. And besides having a store of food, also a lot of the moisture in the exhalation of the kangaroo rat will be absorbed by that dry food. And so it regains the moisture when it eats it. We've already talked about some of the adaptations of the sidewinder. And then, of course, the desert bighorn sheep has a carotid reed. It is, if you look at its body mass, it is smaller than the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep that's in the same genus, different species. And so it has adaptations. Then it is also an extremely mobile animal, and it has the ability to drink over 20% of its body weight in water at a single drink. In plants, basically there are two strategies to survive in the desert, and we call these strategies avoiders and adapters. And if you've ever been out in the desert, say in 2019 or 2017, when we had good rainfall, and in the springtime it's just packed with wildflowers. But if you go out there in the middle of the summer, or if you go out there in a dry year like this year, you're not going to see them. They're not going to be there because they're just surviving as seeds in the soil. They're not actually germinating and forming plants. And there are a number of germination cues that will cause a plant to the seeds to germinate and form a plant. And probably the easiest one to explain is that in some seed coats, there are inhibitors that prevent water from penetrating into the embryo within the seed. but that material can be leached out after enough exposure to water at the right temperature. And so in a good rainfall year, when it's warm in the spring, those germination inhibitors will be leached out and the seed can grow. And so then the plants there can go through its life cycle and produce more seeds. On the right is Creosote Scrub. And for those of you familiar with the creosote, it's one of the all-time desert adapted plants. It has both deep and shallow roots. It has very small leaves with a tough cuticle, so it doesn't lose a lot of water through evaporation. And so the creosote plant probably accounts for more ground cover than any other plant in the Anza Borrego Desert, and is one of the most, by area, common plants in North America. And so we talk about morphological adaptations of plants, things like that certain plants have leaves that are held at an angle to the sun. Also, plants have fuzzy or light colored coatings that reflect away sunlight. They have thick, waxy cuticles that reduce the loss of water through evaporation. We also have things like cactus that have succulent stems that can store water. And then also that they have, like a barrel cactus, there are accordion-like pleats in the trunk that then can expand to allow the plant to obtain more water, to store more water. And we talk about water potential and hydraulic redistribution. The roots of a plant don't pump water up into the plant. The thing that moves water in a plant is, number one, capillary action, the tendency of water to move through very narrow vessels, and also water potential. Water tends to move from areas of high concentration to low concentration, and also osmotic movement, where water tends to move from areas of low solute concentration to high concentration. And that's how water moves into roots, because there are more solutes in the water in the roots than there are in the water outside of it. And then capillary action and water potential moves it up into the plant. Also, roots will tend to move water down into the soil. If you get a rainfall and water near the surface, well, the water potential is greater deeper down, and so the water will travel through the roots down into deeper soil, which helps conserve water for the plants. And two common types of plants in the desert are succulents, plants which are able to store a large amount of water, such as a barrel cactus or the leaves of an agave, and phreatophytes. And phreato means well in Greek. And so these are plants that have extremely deep root systems and can reach the soil water down below. And so plants like the desert ironwood and Palo Verde are phreatophytes, and also acacia. And we talk about how energy as food moves through an ecosystem. And the foundation of all ecosystems, in terrestrial ecosystems, are green plants that produce food. And then there are herbivores that eat the plants, and then carnivores that eat the animals that eat plants. And so as we go up in a trophic pyramid, there's less biomass produced at each level above, because a lot of the energy that's absorbed by eating food gets used up as energy, and also because of insufficient or inefficient energy transport. So only about 10% of the food energy at each level in trophic period is transferred to the next one. So you can see that plants are very common, then the animals that eat plants are less common, then the animals that eat plants are even less common. And so at the top end of your top end predators, they tend to be animals that are, first of all, relatively rare and also cover long distances, say like mountain lions or eagles and hawks. But if you actually look at who eats who within an ecosystem, there are animals like, say, a coyote that eats plants, eats small animals, eats reptiles, and then also is a carrion eater as well. And so it participates on many different levels in the trophic pyramid. So really, the trophic pyramid becomes more of a trophic web. pollination relationships. One of the great examples of coevolution, of the evolution of one organism affecting the evolution of another, are pollination relationships. I mean, we all know about hummingbirds, and hummingbirds, of course, are adapted to feed from plants that have long red tube flowers, and they have long skinny beaks that fit in there. And so the hummingbird pollinates the plant, and then the plant gives a meal to the hummingbird. And probably a lesser known example is our bats. And in the desert, many cacti and also agave are pollinated by bats at nighttime. And these plants tend to have large light colored flowers that have sort of a basin shape. And there are basically two kinds of bats that pollinate these plants. And some are specialists, like the Mexican long-tongued bat, and they're capable of hovering in flight. And also they have a long ribbed tongue that can actually reach into the plant and harvest nectar. Okay, then there are other bats that are not as specifically adapted to pollination or harvesting nectar, and like the pallid bat. The pallid bat can't hover, and it doesn't have that long tongue. And so we call them face planters, meaning that when they, most of the time they eat insects, but facultatively they will dine on nectar. And so when they dine on nectar, basically they just plant their whole face in it, slurp up as much nectar as they can, and then move on. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at how effectively the bats pollinate the plant they're feeding on, actually the nectar specialists are less effective pollinators than the face planters, because the face planters will transfer about 13 times as much pollen from one plant to the next than the nectar specialist will. And another thing in predator-prey relationships are coloration. You know, if you're poisonous and you've evolved toxins to keep from being eaten, it makes sense that you let other animals know that. And so animals that tend to be poisonous or bad tasting tend to have very bright color patterns. And this is aposomatic coloration. And apo means sign, and somatic refers to the body. So just a body with a sign on it. And monarch butterflies are one. They're very unappetizing, both as caterpillars and as adults to especially birds. And so their aposomatic coloring warns birds away. Now, also there's the Viceroy butterfly, which is not toxic, but has a color pattern very similar to the monarch. And in places where both monarchs and Viceroy butterflies live, the viceroys are less preyed upon than they are in other areas. And that's known as Batesian mimicry, meaning that if you're not a really bad dude, it sure pays to look like one. So you've evolved the coloration of a similar species that is non-palatable. Okay, enhanced sentences are very important in the desert because it's hot during the day and it's cooler during the night. And so if you want to go out in the night, your senses have to be a little bit sharper. And one of the things that helps animals see at night is the Tapitum Lucidum, which is a reflective coating in the back of an eye. You know, if you've ever been driving along the shoulder of a road at night and you see sort of that green reflection from an animal's eyes, that's the reflection of your headlights that are shining off the Tapitum Lucidum in the back of the animal's eye. And the reason it does that is the light shines through the eye, it passes through the retina, and so the retina is able to get some information from that, but then it reflects off that layer behind it and passes through the light again, through the retina again. So the retina gets a double dose of light, and what you're seeing in that eye shine is that part of the light that's being reflected back out through the retina and through the eyeball. Another thing that's another adaptation that kangaroo rats have are auditory bullae, which are these big hollow cavities within their skull that are right next to the bones in their ears, or their inner ears. And it acts as sort of like an echo chamber that collects sound, but it also allows them to hear in lower frequencies because they're relatively large open areas. And so, for instance, owls that prey on rodents in the desert, owls have double filamented feathers, meaning that they don't branch just once, they branch twice. And this actually lessens the amount of noise that the feathers make, that when the owls flare their wings, like when they're diving on prey and they flare their wings just before they make contact, they make a very low frequency sound. Now, most rodents can't hear that, but kangaroo rats, because they have auditory bullae, can. And so that allows them to make one last desperate jump to avoid the owl. And another example of, there are a couple other examples of coevolution. And most people know about the tarantula hawk and tarantulas, and that tarantula hawk is a wasp that preys on those large hairy spiders that we see and commonly call tarantulas. And the tarantula hawk will sting the spider, it will paralyze the spider. The tarantula hawk will drag it into a underground chamber that it has prepared and then lay its eggs on the abdomen of the spider. So the spider's not dead, it's still alive, it's just paralyzed. And so as the eggs of the tarantula hawk mature, the grubs then actually eat the living spider, and they avoid the vital organs. And so it keeps the spiders alive as long as possible. A little less gruesome set of example of coevolution are creosote galls. And anybody who's been out in the desert and looked at creosote bushes have seen those galls, these big swellings that are on the branches and leaves of the creosote. And they're caused by creosote gall midges, which are small insects. And what they do is they have an ovipositor, which is an organ that they stick into the creosote plant and they lay an egg. And also they carry the spores of a species of fungus that has a obligatory relationship with that species of creosote gall midge. And we know of at least 15 different species of creosote gall midges, and they infest different parts of the creosote plant. Some infest the branches, some infest the little twigs, some go into the leaves, some go into the flowers, and some go into the fruit. And so each species of creosote gall midge has a species of fungus that it has that relationship to. And so when the egg is laid, that swelling forms the gall, and then a fungus from those spores grows on the inside of the gall, and the pupa of the creosote gall midge, as it grows, will eat that, and it's called mycelium. And they'll eat it, and then when they're ready to emerge as adults, they will actually harvest the spores of the fungus and take that with them, so that when they lay their eggs, they can inject those spores into the creosote. So, and what's even more interesting is that you have those 15 species of creosote gall midges, and they in turn are parasitized by 17 different species of wasp and sawflies that will attack the creosote gall, and with their ovipositor, stick it inside the gall, find the pupa, and inject it with their own eggs. So a very complex web of relationships, and very interesting. And we also talk about habitats and their distribution in the physical environment. Up in the higher reaches of the desert, we have pinyon juniper woodlands, and actually even above that in the Santa Rosa Mountains, we have yellow pine forest. And then going down, we have desert chaparral, and then rocky slopes, which have a lot of plants particular to that. And on various places, you have wet spots like oases and streams and washes and arroyos that support a different type of vegetation. And then bajadas, which are the alluvial fans that come out of desert canyons, and they have a different type of vegetation. And then, of course, down in the playas and sinks and bosques, you often have plants that are adapted to the conditions of salinity and alkalinity that you find there. And some of the riparian associations, this is the first palm grove at Borrego Palm Canyon on the left, and this is Coyote Creek. So even in the desert, we do have wet spots and the vegetation that takes advantage of those. And then Creosote Scrub, which is probably the largest vegetation type in the in the Colorado Desert, of which Anza Borrego is a part. It's the Colorado River Desert. And then also we have playas, which have not a whole lot of vegetation, but vegetation that's adapted to those particular conditions, like iodine weed. Okay, human prehistory and entry into the Americas. Now, you know, I'm in my late 60s, and when I went to school, we were all taught that originally the first Native Americans entered North America by crossing a land bridge across the Bering Strait. Well, since then, that's been somewhat revised, and a new or a more recent theory is called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. And that theory holds that that Native Americans, the people that were to become Native Americans, migrated into North America by following the continental margins and the very rich biomes that you find along there. If you think about it, if you're walking along the shore, and especially if the shore, a lot more shorelines exposed back during the Pleistocene, when sea levels were about 100 meters lower, that there's a lot of good stuff there. There's shellfish, there's fish, there's seaweed, there are marine mammals, all of which would have been sort of naive to human predation. And so people migrating into the Americas following that path followed down the coast of North America, Central America, and South America. Now, one of the reasons that this theory developed was that the oldest human settlements in the New World aren't in North America. They're not in Alaska. They're not in Canada. They're in South America, in Monte Verde, which is in Chile. And so we have archaeological remains that are older in southern South America than we do in northern North America. And the oldest archaeological site in California is out on the Channel Islands. And also the oldest sites in North America are in Mexico and southern Texas. So this suggests strongly that that people didn't enter North America through the Bering Strait and ice-free corridor, but more likely along the coasts of the continents. And in Anza Borrego, we do have some evidence of people living here as many as 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. And if you've been out, especially in the eastern part of Anza Borrego, in many areas there are what are called sleeping circles, which are probably the foundations of brush huts that were made by human beings thousands of years ago. And these early settlements, or these early sites, when they have been excavated, the projectile points that are found there are not small arrow points as we find in more recent areas, but larger points that we believe were used with a tool called an addle or a spear thrower, which was like an extension of the arm. It's a large stick with a socket in the end, and you'd put the end of a dart in it, and then you would throw the dart by flicking it forward. And that's a technology that predates the bow and arrow. And so that is associated with some of these older sites. More recent sites that you can see are grinding circles and also basin rubs, as you see on the right. And this suggests that people in the later prehistoric periods were using more vegetable foods than animal foods. And so probably their diets were expanding and they were taking advantage of more types of food. And then also, this is a hunting blind up in Yaqui Pass. It's believed that it was an area that was set up for hunters to ambush bighorn sheep, which moved between Yaqui Ridge and Pinyon Mountain along this path. And then also on the right is a shelter cave in the far south end of Anza Borrego. And this particular shelter cave has been excavated by archaeologists twice, and they have found datable biological remains that go back as old as 7,000 years. So it's actually the oldest site in Anza Borrego, the oldest dated site in Anza Borrego. And then some of the other things that you can see, this on the left is a core, or it's a rock that was used as a source for flakes. And then the flakes that were struck off the core would be used to make things like blades and scrapers and projectile points. And then on the right is, that's from the Cave of the Blue Sun at Indian Hill in Anza Borrego, and it's a pictograph. And these are from probably the more recent periods of Native American occupation. Okay, the future. Well, one thing that we pretty well know by now is that weather and climate are changing in the Colorado Desert and in Anza Borrego. And one of the things that is happening is that our weather is becoming progressively drier and warmer. And also we're seeing a shift in precipitation, that we're getting less precipitation during the winter as the blocking action of high pressure systems becomes more prevalent. And then also during the summer, we're seeing more monsoonal moisture coming from the south. So we're probably getting less rain, and we're also getting rain in a different season than we've had it before. And so we're getting less rain during the winter and more rain during the late summer and fall. And so this is probably going to influence the distribution of plants. For instance, our weather is becoming more like northern Baja than it is to the areas to the north of us, like the Mojave Desert. So it is likely that that we will see a biota more similar to Baja. And then also, as the plant distribution change, we know that animal distributions change. Now, the question that comes up is, of course, that we've seen evidence of this before. That during the Pleistocene, there were some extreme climate change took place, and we know that plants and animals migrated north and south as the climate changed, and they also migrated up and down elevation-wise. But during the Pleistocene, we didn't have the city of Los Angeles. We didn't have the Bay Area. We didn't have the city of San Diego that are blocking the paths of migration of plants and animals. So the question is as the climate changes, how are plants and animals going to be able to adapt to this if they can't migrate past those points? And also in terms of elevation, the plants that we have living at the highest elevation, say those yellow pine forests in the Santa Rosa Mountains and the pinyon pines and junipers that live just beneath them, they're pretty much in the highest places that we have. And so essentially, is climate change going to push them off the tops of the mountains? And those habitats just won't exist in this part of California anymore. So, during one thing that has been very satisfying to me over the years that I've been involved in Anza Borrego is that how supportive the human population of California has been of this park and other parks. That when the park has faced challenges such as most recently the Sunrise Power Link, and before that the plans to put a highway through Coyote Canyon, and at one point to dam Coyote Canyon, make it a large reservoir, that the public has been the effective voices in supporting the park and protecting it. During the Sunrise Power Link, the Sunrise Power Link was a plan to put a power corridor, a series of large power towers across the middle of Anza Borrego, take electricity from the area to the east in Imperial County, where there's geothermal energy and solar energy, and transport it over to San Diego where it could be used. And it would have had a tremendous impact on the park. And when I say we, I mean the professional park staff that were working at Anza Borrego were told by the governor's office that we would not comment on this project publicly. And some of us bent that rule a little bit, but it was really the public that sort of rose up and protected the park. And a politician, and these are ultimately the people that make decisions, don't really care what I, as a park employee, thought. They don't care. What they do care about is what voters think. And so when it became apparent that there was a strong wave of support for the park, that plan was abandoned and moved south of the park. So anyway, I'm just saying that presenting that as an example, how concerned individuals, people like you that really do care, can help protect parks like Anza Borrego and ensure that we have these resources for the future. So anyway, I'd just like to say thank you for listening. And I guess now we will take questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was extremely informative. We do have a couple of questions, and if people want to keep typing questions in the Q&A, please do so. Colleen asks, with global warming and rising seas, will the deltas fill in again, do you think, in the future?
Boy, that's a good question. I think that I'm trying to think of how much, sea level rise we'd have to get get over the, the Salton Sea is more than 200 feet below sea level. And however, the rise in between,
Which is
where Lake Kauai was, is about, the high point is about 70 feet above sea level. So the sea level would have to come up that high for it to go back in over the deltas and into the trough that was once occupied by the Imperial Sea and then Lake Kauai.
Okay. Ashley asks, how can you be confident that early humans overhunted large mammals, contributing to their extinction? And then Tim was going, piggybacking on that and asking about the comet theory. Like, you didn't mention that. Is that, you think that was part of the extinctions too?
That's dinosaurs.
Well, I'll answer the first one first. That's speculation based on some evidence that we do know that Clovis people hunted large mammals. To what extent, that's hard to say, because archaeological sites are very rare, and especially the ones that are that old, because most of the places that were good for people to live then are the same places that are good to people to live now. So a lot of that evidence has been demolished by development in recent times. So again, that's speculation. And also there's been evidence in some places that that early people drove animals off cliffs. I believe there's a place called Bison Fall in Wyoming where that was documented as having taken place. But again, we don't know. Of course, that was prehistory, and so there are no written records, and so, yeah, don't know. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
The comet theory.
That's way before me.
Well, if you're talking about there are actually two here that I think. One is when the extinction of the dinosaurs, which took place 60 million years ago, and that probably didn't have it. But there was also a comet theory of hitting Canada about the time of the Pleistocene extinctions, but I don't know that that's really been linked. We know that took place, but there's not as much evidence to support that it had impact on animal populations.
The big climate extinction was dinosaurs.
Well, these are different, huh? Okay.
Okay. Marty is asking, how deep can phreatophyte roots go? Did I pronounce that right?
Phreatophyte.
Thanks, phreatophyte.
Well, I think the deepest ones are maybe in the order of 100 to 150 feet.
That's pretty deep. Wow.
And it's in phreatophyte. What's interesting about phreatophytes is that their growth periods aren't during the winter, as it is with most desert plants. It's actually during the summer, because that's when there's enough thermal energy to help lift that water from great depths by evaporation on the leaf surfaces. And then because water is cohesive and you have capillary action going, that it tends to pull the water up and into the upper parts of the plant.
Cynthia is asking, how many bat species can be found in Anza Borrego?
Ooh. Pallid. I don't know. I'd have to sit down and count.
Okay.
But there are there are western pipistrelles, pallid bats, long-tongued Mexican bats,
Leaf-nosed.
leaf-nosed bats, more than I know.
Okay. B kind of answered that question, and she said between 13 and 17. Do you think that
Oh,
sounds
wow,
about right?
okay.
Mastiff.
What is your favorite spot in Anza Borrego that most people don't know about?
Ooh,
Joe is
ooh.
asking that.
Let me think a second. I would say probably Fourth Palm Grove and Borrego Palm Canyon. Actually, a lot of people know about that. I would say down in the south end of the park, there's a little canyon that goes up to a place called Sombrero Peak, and there is a spring up there that I'm not going to tell you where exactly it is, but it's a beautiful area and lots of good wildlife and tremendous views going out to the east.
Excellent. Are cougars, this is from an anonymous person asking, are cougars considered the top predator of the desert? Have they become less abundant in the desert over time, maybe due to climate change, which affects the distribution of other animals at the lower trophic level?
Well, they are pretty much the top of our trophic heap in the desert, and we do, they range so widely that a study that was done on male cougars, and I'm trying to remember when this was done, and this was probably in the 1990s, but we had 4 different male cougars, of which Anza Borrego was part of their range. And one of them ranged as far as Crystal Cove in Orange County. And then one of the other ones ranged down into Mexico. So it's hard to say how abundant cougars are in Anza Borrego, because I don't think there are any that live just within the park. And I think the big problem for cougars in Southern California is just displacement of habitat, that so much habitat has been taken up by human development that it takes a lot of area to support one cougar. And we don't have a lot of those big undivided areas anymore.
Okay. This question comes from Stephen. Do you see range recession happening with any of these native plants in the desert? And how are invasive plants like non-native brassicas changing the desert ecology?
Brassica is a problem. Oh gosh, I'm trying to Saharan mustard, Russian thistle, brome. There are so many. A problem is that a lot of desert plants are narrowly distributed plants in terms of their environmental preferences, whereas a lot of these invasive plants are cosmopolitan. They grow just about everywhere and they're extremely adaptive. And so whenever there's a disturbance, these non-native plants can get in and get established, and then to get them out is a tremendous problem. And so we do have, and then also, for instance, non-native grasses, annual grasses can become established during wet years, and then they die, but they're still flammable. And so areas in the desert that were not flammable because there wasn't not enough continuity between the plants, now fires can spread through them because they can burn these non-native annual grasses. And so a lot of areas that have been burned by fire, the native plants don't come back because in those places in the desert, they're not fire adapted, as opposed to, say, like chaparral or pine forest. And so they get displaced by these non-native plants that are, cosmopolitan invaders.
Kenneth is asking, could you clarify geographical distinction between the Colorado Desert versus the Sonoran Desert?
Okay, the Colorado Desert is actually a subpart of the Sonoran Desert. Okay, the Colorado Desert is the part of the larger desert area that is drained by the Colorado River. Okay, and so that defines the Colorado Desert. And the Sonoran Desert is actually a larger area going south into Mexico and I'm trying to think of
Arizona.
Yeah, Arizona and parts of New Mexico.
Okay. Sue is asking, at what elevation are the yellow pine forests in the Santa Rosas? And at what part of the range?
Okay, if you look at the Santa Rosas and Toro Peak is, I'm looking from the Borrego Valley, and so I'm looking to the north, and so the west end would be Toro Peak, and they're distributed patchily down to the shoulder that's on the west, and then they sort of fade out, and then it's pinyon pine juniper forest below that. So that's probably around 6,000 feet elevation. And
okay. Kay is asking, well, she says, I recall that organic materials in the Paisley Cave in Central Oregon was dated to earlier than 10,000 years. What was the date of the materials in southern Chile?
in southern Chile, I believe that it's about 16,000 years. It's in the book. But this is like, you taking a test in college you took 4 years ago, and you really knew a lot of stuff right then. And then people come back and ask you the same question. And it's like, oh boy.
Well, they should get the book, right?
They should get the book.
That's right. John is asking, what is the most common native grass in Anza Borrego?
Boy, what? Stipa? I'm guessing here. My wife is quickly running and getting the plant guide to Anza Borrego, which we also wrote, but we're, like I said, sometimes you don't remember this stuff.
Okay, we can move on to another question.
Okay.
Somebody, Maureen is asking, would you ever give a talk about fire ecology?
Funny. Well, yes, I have done that in the past. And so it's a topic right now. And actually my wife and I have been discussing what we're going to do next. And I've been thinking of a natural history of fire in California. I think right now that would be a very current topic.
For sure. R. Mitchell is asking, in your opinion, what areas of for inclusion within the park boundary?
I'm sorry, I kind of broke up there in the middle.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to go slower. In your opinion, what areas of private lands have a priority for acquisition for inclusion within the park boundary? And what damage do you see from the ORV area of the park?
Well, I think that I'm getting kind of an echo here. But anyway, we have several areas that have been identified by the Anza Borrego Foundation for prioritized acquisition. And the foundation, acquiring lands for a park, there are targets of opportunity that come up, especially for a park as large as Anza Borrego. And so, property changes hands, an owner dies and passes it on to their relatives who aren't interested in keeping it. And so the Anza Borrego Foundation is a group that collects money and uses it to buy land for the park, and then eventually sells it to the state park system, and then uses the money that they get to go out and acquire other lands. And so it's sort of like a revolving fund that allows the park and the foundation to take advantage of these targets of opportunity that come up from time to time.
And the proceeds from this book are royalties.
And the proceeds from this book go to the Anza Borrego Foundation. So yes, we aren't taking royalties for the book. It's going to the foundation.
Excellent. One last geology question. Indian Hill and Piedras Grandes don't seem to be close to water. Also the area with a lot of morteros in Blair Valley. Was water there before? This is a question from Jennifer.
Well, the drying trend that we've been in basically since the end of the Pleistocene with a few interruptions of more precipitation. But I mean, that's a good question. I've wondered that too. I mean, Indian Hill, the closest water is down at Creosote Palms now, which is a healthy walk from there. And I think that there may have been other places where wells were dug. For instance, if you go to Yaqui well, there's a clue, by Tamarisk Grove, the Indians dug wells there to get down to the water level. And I think there may have been places to the, I guess that would be the south of Indian Hill at the base of large canyons where maybe there is water if you dig deep enough. But I mean, to me, it is kind of a mystery because it's a long walk to the nearest water, but we know that people live there and live there for a long time.
Blair Valley is probably a dry lake, though. So that probably had water real near the surface.
And places like Blair Valley had seasonal water from time to time. And so a lot of these places where there are archaeological remains weren't permanent residences where people lived year round. They were mainly there during the favorable times of year.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for all this unbelievably good information on Anza Borrego. We are almost out of time, so I really just need to quickly say goodbye and thank you so much. You have a lot of comments about wonderful informative lecture from people, but I just want to put a plug for the book again. It is available on the Anza Borrego Foundation website. So just type that in and you'll get to the website and you can buy the book. And like Mike said, all the proceeds go to the foundation, which is really, really nice. And remember that this presentation was recorded and will be available for viewing usually within a couple of days on our chapter Facebook page and our YouTube page. So you can get them both easily from our homepage website, which is cnpssd.org. And thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Wells. Good night, everybody.
Okay, well, thank you all. And remember, support your park.
Thank you very much.